Welcome everyone to this Predictive Services webinar being hosted by AFAC. I'd like to welcome everyone here that's participating live, and also those that are listening to this on recording, because this will be recorded and placed on the AFAC website, along with the other series of webinars that have already been done. My name is Greg Anoff. I work for AFAC and support the Predictive Services Group. Mike Wouters, who is the normal host of these, is on well-earned holidays. So apology from Mike for not being able to attend today. As I said, the webinar is being recorded, so just make everyone aware of that. There will be an opportunity for people to raise questions in the chat panel. And down the bottom, and we'll see if Andrew can address a relevant one to those after the webinar. And also you will be able at the end to raise your hand, and if we're good enough to see your hand raised, Andrew may select you for answering your questions. Those that are in the chat box, with Andrew's good grace, if we don't get to them today, you might have time to answer them individually afterwards, so we'll see how we go. So, as I said, welcome to the webinar. Without any further ado, I think I won't steal any of Andrew's punch and try and talk anything about the topic today. So I'd just like to welcome Dr. Andrew Sullivan from CSIRO, a very strong partner of AFAC and the fire services over many, many years. So welcome, Andrew, for this presentation. And this is a journey back in the past and a fascinating understanding of a very eminent researcher, Alan McArthur, and the work that sits around it. So I'm very conscious of not stealing your thunder, Andrew. So I'll hand over to you and leave it in your capable hands. So welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining me for this talk. Let me just share my screen. Can everybody see the title screen? Yep, all good. So I'd actually like to thank Mike Wouters for inviting me to talk here today. This talk that I'm going to give evolved out of one that I presented at a workshop towards the end of last year that Mike participated in. He thought it might be of more general interest to the F-band network. That talk focused solely on McArthur's forest fire research, so I've expanded a little bit to include some of his grassland work as well. It's a brief account of Alan McArthur's work because a 20-minute talk couldn't do justice to all of the research that Alan McArthur actually did over his years. So this is basically a very brief précis of some of the more pertinent work that he did and how it sort of fits with the F-band network. So, a brief outline is a very short biographical snapshot of who Alan McArthur actually was. Discussion of the Mangapla fire, McArthur's challenge when he started work in bushfire research, a little bit of discussion of his experimental methodology, some detailing of the fire prediction systems that he developed over his years and some of the related revisions that occurred to those. And then very briefly, discussion of analysis of the predictive performance of some of those systems, and then attempt to try to summarise all that. So Alan McArthur was born in 1923, which in a couple of weeks would have made him 97 if he was still alive. He grew up on a wheat farm at Merriwagga in the northern Riverina area of New South Wales and was educated at the Yanco Agricultural High School. He joined the Forestry Commission as an 18-year-old, Forestry Commission in New South Wales as an 18-year-old in 1941, and then entered into a Bachelor of Science Forestry degree at the University of Sydney and the Australian Forestry School here in Canberra, graduating in 1945. He was assigned to plantation management in the Tumut and Orange districts once he finished there. And it was when he was stationed at Tumut that he got an interest in fire, I would think, because there was a fire that was very, very close to his professional interest, and that was the Mangapla fire of January and February 1952. So this fire actually started from fettlers burning off near the railway line, not far from the township of Mangapla, and it was contained within a day or two to a few hundred hectares. But on the 24th of January, it broke away from sparks from a burning stump well within the burnt area of that fire. And then under strong northwesterly winds, travelled over 60 miles in the first 2 days from north of Holbrook down to north of Corrion. And during those 2 days, it sustained speeds of up to 13 kilometres an hour through mixed fuel types, mostly farmland and woodlands, as you'd expect in that part of the world. Overall, the fire burnt 330,000 hectares, but most of that was in the first 2 days, as you can see in this graphic. The red and the purple are the first 2 days of spread. The green is subsequent spread over a period of a week and a bit. So this fire had a significant impact on Alan McArthur because he was the fire control officer based at Tumut. Now, this fire in itself didn't have an immediate impact, but it certainly must have stayed at the back of his mind for most of his fire career. So he became Australia's first full-time bushfire researcher when he was employed by the Commonwealth Forest and Timber Bureau in late 1953. And he was tasked with constructing a national fire danger rating system for Australian conditions with a specific focus on fires in dry eucalypt forest, pine forest and grasslands. So you can see that there aren't many photos of Alan McArthur to be had, and we've been trawling through the extensive CSIRO slide collection to try to find photos. And these are probably two of the best ones that you'd find apart from the one that was on the front page. So McArthur, as a forester, brought a very hands-on pragmatic approach to fire research. And one of the first things that he did was start burning stuff. So the summer of 1953-54, so he started in November of 1953. That summer, he started a project called Fire Behaviour in Annual Grasslands, where he went out and lit lots of fires and took measurements. And he brought that very hands-on empirical approach to basically everything that he did in this space. In 1956-57 season, he commenced work on a project called Fire Behaviour in Dry Eucalypt, the Rossii Association, which is basically the local species of eucalypts in the ACT. And over the next 10, 15 years, he burnt many fires in a few locations around the countryside. Over 400 plus fires were conducted during a 4-year period in the ACT at Cohen Forest and Bull's Head Creek. And he continued that burning on Black Mountain itself in the centre of Canberra, utilising students from the Australian Forestry School to actually allow him to conduct those experiments. What he found, and this is an observation in one of his reports, was that there was more opportunity for burning in forest fields due to the more sedate nature of forest fires compared with grass fires. And that probably says more about the types of fires that he was conducting than any of the data that he collected. In 1958, so he'd been there for less than 5 years, McArthur presented a paper at the Fire Weather Conference in Melbourne by the Bureau of Meteorology called The Preparation and Use of Fire Danger Tables. It was the first publication by McArthur where he outlined the work that he'd been doing in the fuel type, the 3 fuel types that he'd been instructed to work in. But the results that he presented were only for those in eucalypt litter. Towards the end of that year, he commenced another project called Fire Behaviour in Dry Eucalypt Jarrah Association. And it was in this work in Western Australia that he developed a collaboration with George Peake and started a relationship with West Australian researchers that lasted for many, many years. The experimental approach that McArthur took was basically using the forest that was available to him in the ACT to begin with. Most of this was described as low to medium quality woodland that was representative of lower rainfall forests around Australia. He conducted many of his experiments in midsummer as the objective for the study, of course, was trying to understand the behaviour of high-intensity fires. The fires were ignited at a single point and allowed to grow until they were just suppressible for the prevailing conditions. Now, this is probably a good indication of his skill, because just suppressible is not something that you can easily define beforehand, but it's something that you could define afterwards once you've lost it. So it was a good experience for many of the students that he was employing to conduct this work. What he found was that he wasn't able to actually conduct his experiments on those of extreme fire danger, due to what he calls an imposition of total prohibition of fire, and that meant that he had to extrapolate observations of wildfires to these conditions in order to fill that gap. The results of the work that he got here, he felt, was not typical of high quality forest due to the differences in the wind speed and the increased differences in the wind speed and the increased fuel moisture that would be expected in the high quality forests. Now, the way he conducted these experiments is basically, as I said, to light the fires and then make observations of the intensity, the estimations of the flame height, the spotting potential, what he called the fire instability, and the suppression difficulty of those fires. He took field measurements of air temperature, fuel level temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, both in the forest and in the open, estimates of cloud cover, rainfall, and fuel moisture content. And as I said, he then augmented the data that he gathered with ad hoc observations from wildfires. This is the little insert here is a bit of a snapshot of the method of analysis that was provided to students for experiments at Cohen. So basically, it was about categorising a lot of the data that was collected to make the analysis of that data easier. So in this case, the first step is to group individual fires into fuel moisture classes. And in this case, each fuel moisture class was then grouped into slope classes, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees, and also into fuel quantity classes. These were heavy, average, and sparse, and based on measurements of fuel load. The forward rate of spread was calculated at 2-minute time intervals. So basically every 2 minutes, someone would go around and drop markers to indicate the location of the fire at that 2-minute interval. And the markers were anything from lumps of wood, rocks, to later on pieces of metal plate that could be surveyed in later on, and from which maps of fire spread could be plotted. So the next step is actually plot the rate of spread against the wind velocity to then try to derive a relationship between, in this case, wind velocity and the rate of spread. Little instruction down the bottom: smooth and extrapolate by plotting fire spread against log of time as a linear regression, and replot the spread against the fuel moisture content. Now, this is an example. On the left is a grass fire that was conducted in 1962. And on the right is a forest fire that was conducted in 1957. So you can see, as an example, the fire starting from a point and then allowed to spread for some distance and time. And every 2 or so minutes, a fire perimeter would be mapped based off measurements of the location of the fire perimeter at certain points around the perimeter. McArthur then used state-of-the-art data analysis techniques consisting of pencil and a razor, where he basically did linear regression by eye, and over many, many experiments developed the relationships that he would later use in the fire danger meters that you all know and love. And these are just two examples that are pulled out of many, many boxes of data that we've got. And he was rather good at being able to combine data from multiple experiments. He was forever realigning the curves that he would generate once new data was obtained, and confirming or not confirming his understanding of exactly what the relationships were. In these examples, we've got wind velocity on the horizontal axis. The graph on the left, I think, is rate of forward spread. The graph on the right, it's wind velocity under the canopy, I believe. So he's developing some sort of relationship there between wind velocity in the open and wind velocity under the canopy, and the different curves are there for different density of forests. We've been in the process for the last 10 or so years of trying to collate and digitise a lot of McArthur's data. Jim Gould and Vijay Kool have been hard at work doing most of that work, digitising the fire spread maps that you saw and summarising the observational data that was collected associated with those fires. This is a summary of the forest fire experiments that had been conducted by McArthur during the 50s and 60s. Total number of fires that he's conducted is in the order of 450. And the total number of fire spread observations, so these are the fire spread intervals, the isochrones for each fire, is approaching 5,500. There's an awful lot of data there of these fires that McArthur obtained. You can see from the duration that many fires are very short, only a couple of minutes. Some went for upwards of an hour. And the distance travelled in these fires anywhere from less than a metre up to 50 or 60 metres in many instances. The thing to note is, even though the temperature and relative humidity is quite a range, so some experiments down to 9% relative humidity, temperatures up to mid-30s, the wind speed that was measured under the canopy is not that great. So the maximum wind speed here is 6.4 metres per second under the canopy, which is fairly reasonable, but the majority of them are much, much less than that. And the rates of spread that you can see down the bottom are similarly not ripping fires, if you can describe them like that. This is just an illustration of some of the fire spread observations out of the Black Mountain experiments, just to show you the range of different conditions. So there's some fires. So all of these triangles are individual fire observations, and you could construe which ones belong to the same fire, not necessarily accurately, but some of them you can, so that you can see that as some fires are progressing very quickly, they're travelling the cumulative distance rather quickly over a short amount of time. Other fires are not travelling that far and taking far longer to travel. So there's a very big spread of fire in that. Having done lots and lots of experiments that McArthur did, very early on he understood that there was a need for the results that he produced to actually be in a useful form for operations use. He starts off in the grasslands, he started off with a set of tables, 500 rating tables for annual grasslands published in 1960. But very early on, he understood that tables were not a great tool for people to use, and so worked quite tirelessly to develop slide rules as the paradigm of the time for doing calculations. So this, as far as I can tell, so these are things that I've found in the many, many boxes of stuff that have been hoarded over the years from McArthur's era. This is, I think, what would be the Mark I grassland 500 metre. So you can see it's got two sides, the front side and back side, and basically brings together estimates of temperature and relative humidity to estimate a basic fuel moisture content. There's a relationship there to correct that moisture content for curing and also rainfall. And on the front side, you then take that fuel moisture content related to wind speed and pasture condition in order to determine rate of spread and fire danger index. That evolved into what I'm thinking must be the Mark II metre, which I've dated at around 1963. Basically, rather than having two sides of the 1 metre, they're both put on the same side. So there's two slide rules in the one panel. But again, it's one for determining fuel moisture content and another for applying fuel moisture content with wind speed and fuel information to determine rate of spread and fire danger index. It wasn't until a couple of years later that McArthur shifted from a rectangular slide rule into a circular slide rule. So this is the first version that we came to see more publicly as the Mark III fire danger metre grassland. So does the same thing. So relates temperature, relative humidity, and degree of curing to give an inherent moisture content that then relates is related to wind velocity to give rate of spread. This metre differed from the previous ones in that the pasture condition was dropped as an explicit variable. The metre itself is described for being used in standard average pastures is the terminology that he uses. So it was perhaps an attempt to try to simplify the system, or it was a recognition by McArthur that to make it practical, he needed to have something that was more generic rather than specific to fuel. So the circular slide rule notion dominated for quite a few years. It was what appears in the first major publication of McArthur on grassland fire behaviour, and persisted through. So the Mark IV was what was actually published in that document. Sorry, it wasn't Mark III was published in that document. The Mark IV came a few years later, which was a metrication of the Mark III. And then the Mark V was introduced just prior to his death. And you could be forgiven for thinking that this is remarkably like the Mark I. And I'm suspecting that as he got on in age and I'll go back a step. The Mark V came about because there was a series of fires in Victoria in 1977, the Western District fires, in which it was observed that predictions from the Mark IV metre at that time were over-predicting spread in eaten out pastures. And so I'm thinking that there was an attempt by McArthur to try to address that by reintroducing pasture condition as a variable. And what he did was just revert to what was the Mark I style of meter. Now, I'm not sure how much testing went into that or much thought went into that. It wasn't actually produced by McArthur. It's possible, this was actually produced by the CFA. It's possible that McArthur sent them something similar to the Mark I and they just reissued it and it became the Mark V. It's not clear. What is clear that by going to the Mark V caused all sorts of confusion because it changed the way that the fire danger index was calculated and what it actually meant. Also introduced confusion about the role of fuel load in determining rate of spread. Now, one of the things I forgot to mention in this is that all of these meters have 100 as the worst possible in terms of the fire danger. Now, it seems that the conditions associated with the Mangaplar fire back in 1952 are what McArthur used in the grassland meter to define exactly what he thought was worst possible. So that's why the reference to the Mangaplar fire earlier in my talk. It seems to have stayed with him for quite some time. Now, moving to the forest meter. The forest models that he generated first appeared as tables published by his friend Harry Luke in the Forestry Commission, who was, as I understand it, always keen to take whatever Alan McArthur generated and make it usable for people, even if McArthur hadn't actually got to the point of finalising exactly what they were. So there were quite a few different variants of these tables when they were produced. But similarly to the grassland work that McArthur did, he was very keen to generate a meter that could then be used. So this, I'm thinking, is what would be a Mark II meter from 1961 or 1962. It's very similar to the Mark II grassland meter, is a double slide rule and combines elements that he has recognised as being important for determining fire behaviour and fire danger in forest fields. And I'll talk a little bit more about the details of this meter in a moment. At around the same time as the grassland meter went circular, so did the forest fire danger meter. So this is a very early Mark III from 1963. You can see that it looks very similar to the fire danger meter that we know at the moment. The differences are that rather than a drought index, either KBDI or SDI, McArthur is using here fuel state in and around forest areas expressed as a percentage of dead grass. So basically he's using grass curing as a seasonal measure of fire potential. He then combines that with the number of days since rain and the amount of last rainfall to come up with the drought factor, and then that drought factor is then combined with temperature and relative humidity and wind speed to give a fire danger value. The Mark IV meter, which is what appears in the Fire Behaviour in Eucalypt Forests paper, basically just revises the structure of that Mark III meter. The major difference between those, the Mark III and the Mark IV, is the introduction of the drought index. So in 1964 or 65, McArthur went on a study tour to the US and met George Byron and picked up basically the Keach-Byron drought index that they were using at the time, or developing at the time, and inserted that straight into his meter. And so this was used 2 or 3 years before Keach and Byron actually published their drought index. So it was a rather early implementation of the notion of drought index as a measure of seasonal fire potential. So, as I said, the leaflet 107 was published in 1967. That was the first formal presentation of the forest fire danger meter. And in 1973, there was a metricated version of the Mark IV, converting all of the imperial units to metric units. So just a little bit more detail about the Mark II meter. We can see the three variables that he's selected for that seasonal component of fire danger. Here we've got percentage of dead grass, rainfall to 9 AM and the number of days since rain that give the drought factor. The drought factor is then used with air temperature, relative humidity and wind velocity to give the fire danger index. On the back of the meter, so the back of the meter says that this is fire danger derived from this meter is based on an average fuel quantity of 5 tonnes per acre, which turns out to be 11.2 tonnes per hectare, and is considered desirable for general forecasting purposes over broad areas. So very similar to what he did with the circular grassland fire danger meter, is moving towards a more general predictive tool. But the key bits here is then got a linear relationship between fire danger index and fuel load to then give rate of spread. In this case, joules per hour. So lots of things happened with those systems once he finished developing them in the 60s. Of course, there was that change from curing as a seasonal input to drought index. And that was driven by observations that the forest fields continued to dry out after the grasslands had cured around it. So he was trying to capture the fact that with extended periods of rainfall deficit in summer, the grasses had already cured, but the forest fuels continued to dry out. And that was where he incorporated the Keach-Byron drought index. There was a partially metricated version of the Mark IV in 1968 in which he converted the temperature that was in Fahrenheit into Celsius, but everything else was still in imperial units. It wasn't until 1973 where there was a full metrication of both the Mark IV and the Mark III grassland meters. Both of those systems were adopted by the Bureau of Meteorology for fire weather forecasting, I think in the early 70s. It may well have been in the late 60s, I'm not sure. And then there was the confusion of the Mark V grassland meter in 1978. As I said, there was an attempt by McArthur to try to improve the prediction of fire in eaten out paddocks that was observed during the 1977 Western District fires. It introduced confusion about the role of fuel load on rate of spread, which was further complicated by the introduction of the Burton modified Mark IV, where the fuel load function from the Mark V meter was inserted into the Mark IV meter. And it wasn't until the work of Phil Cheney and Jim Gould many years later, reinforced by the work of Miguel Cruz, that showed that fuel load itself didn't play a significant part in rate of spread in grasslands anyway. In 1980, Noble Baring Gill basically reversed engineered equations out of the meters so that the equations could be used in computative systems. They described the equations as giving an almost exact fit to the meters. There's a lot of variation in the meters themselves just because of the way they're put together. So it would be rather remarkable if a set of equations for one meter produced exact outputs of another meter. And the way that the equations fit together basically is the way that such meters are designed in the first place. So the adding of logarithmic functions is how those meters work. So it's not surprising that you could get pretty good equations out of those meters. So in the bottom line there, the relationship between the FDI value that McArthur generated was directly related to the rate of spread of a fire in the forest. Basically, it's the product of the forest fire danger index and the fuel load multiplied by a 20% increase to give you the rate of spread. In grass, it was anywhere between 0.11 or 0.14, I think. I think in the final version of the Nobel Barringil, the value that they selected was 0.13 multiplied by the grassland fire danger index to give you a rate of spread. Now, after the introduction of McArthur's meters, there was lots of opportunities for assessing how well they did. And the further time went along, the more evidence there was that the McArthur meters, particularly in the forest areas, but also in the grass, were not performing as well as one would hope. So there was lots of case studies and anecdotal observations of under-prediction of rate of spread, particularly on severe wildfires. And for example, coming out of Ash Wednesday 1 and 2, 1980 and 1983, often the under-prediction is pinpointed to the behaviour of large established fires burning under severe conditions. And there was also growing scientific evidence for poor predictive ability of McArthur's model. So at the top here is an example from Project Aquarius, a Project Aquarius experiment, where the black line shows the observed rate of spread of the experiment and the green line is what the McArthur system would predict for those conditions. So there's a big difference there, more than 5 or 6 times difference. Solhurst et al. 1992 showed that there was actually an over-prediction by the McArthur system on very slow-moving fires, but also suggesting that there was an under-prediction for faster-moving fires. That was reinforced by the work of Neil Burrows in his coming out of his PhD thesis, where there was significant under-prediction on very fast-moving fires using the McArthur forest fire danger meter. But also, if you see closely in the bottom left-hand corner there's also significant over-prediction for very, very slow-moving fires. With the Project Vestal work, there was another opportunity to scientifically analyse the behaviour of the performance of the McArthur system against well-documented experimental fires burning in dry eucalypt forests. So Lockie McCaw, Jim Gould and Phil Cheney published some analysis of a number of different systems, one of which was the McArthur's forest fire danger meter. And that showed that there was significant under-prediction, particularly in shrubby forests, forests with a shrubby understory, that it could be anywhere up to 2 or 3 times under-predicting the rate of spread of fires. More recently, Musa Kilinik collected a lot of wildfire data and did comparisons with the McArthur forest meter, and also showed that there was quite a bit of under-prediction, significant under-prediction for the McArthur meter. What he also did was then also use some of the variations that people had been applying to McArthur to try to improve its performance, one of which is to not just consider the surface fuel load, but also the total fine fuel load. And as you can see, the difference between A and B in this graph is basically just to shift all the dots to the right, because there's a linear relationship between fuel load and rate of spread. But even in doing that, it doesn't actually improve the behaviour of the model at the faster rates of spread that much. And the bottom one also applies a wind correction factor in an attempt to try to improve the model. Now, as I said, the forest fire model was found to consistently under-predict, particularly in strong winds, anything greater than 12 kilometres an hour in the open, and in complex fields, so that shrubby understory. The McArthur model is found to under-predict quite considerably across a broad range of conditions, locations and fuels. The apparent better performance that is seen at low spread rates may actually stem from the bias in the model to low predictions rather than actually correctly capturing the interactions of the variables. So you have to be very careful about applying McArthur's model under those conditions. It may appear to work because it gives a value that's closer to what's being observed, particularly if the fires are being restricted in their spread in any way. But it may not actually be working for the right reason. And as a result of all this and the purpose of the workshop that we had last year, efforts are underway in collaboration with the New South Wales Rural Fire Service to actually develop a new forest fire spread model that's more accurate across the full range of conditions and easier to implement than the dry eucalypt model that came out of Project Vesta. So in summary, McArthur, well, before I get the summary, it's actually, so McArthur in 1970 became director of the Forest and Timber Bureau's Forest Research Institute and essentially moved away from conducting research. He left a lot of the bushfire research leadership in the hands of Phil Cheney. In 1975, when the Forest and Timber Bureau moved into CSIRO, he became a principal research scientist at the new Division of Forest Research. And basically had a senior executive role in helping run that division. He retired in July of 1978 and died of pneumonia in November of that year. He had suffered from diabetes his whole life. The book that he'd written with Harry Luke over many years was published that same year, so this is Bushfires in Australia, and it still remains required reading for anyone who wants to study or work with bushfires. He was a remarkable observer of fire behaviour. If you read what he's written, there's some really nuanced descriptions of fire behaviour that reveal the depth. Hang on. That reveal the depth of his understanding of how fires behave. And what you see, sorry about that. And what you see is that there's a bit of a divide between what he knew and what he conveyed in his papers and books and what he was actually able to capture in the operational systems. His pragmatic forester's approach to research meant that a lot of what he generated, a lot of the outputs of his work found people eager to implement them. And Harry Luke was one of those. Over the period of his active research career, which was 1953 to 1970, so 17 years, he initiated and developed a national bushfire research capability, which basically continues today and drives much of the operational and empirical focus of Australian bushfire research. In that 17 years that he actually did fire research, he made some remarkable advances in our understanding of bushfires on a scale that no one has been able to actually approach. So it's something that is amazing to have happened with someone to come into a field like that and then have such a huge impact in building basically from scratch an understanding of a very, very complex phenomena and building tools that allow people to actually make sense of what's happening in that phenomena. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that absolutely fascinating presentation. And it's just remarkable. I mean, I think those of us in the field know and use McArthur all of the time, but to just sit and reflect on the impact that he has had for the sector, it's just amazing. So thank you for compiling that for us and putting it together for us so that we can actually reflect on what achievements he's actually made. Fantastic. Now, there's no questions I can see in the chat box. I'm not sure if anyone online has got a question. There's a way I think you can wave your hand, and I'm not too sure how that happens. But if anyone's got a question they want to put in the chat box, that's fine. Or wave your hand, and hopefully Ben will see the hand getting waved, because I'm not sure if I will. No, it looks pretty good. So Andrew, I think it's an amazing presentation. So we'll leave it at that. And look, I'll thank you very much for it. It actually shows the strength of CSIRO in this sector over many years, and you know, they were world leading many years ago, and are still very active contributors in this space. And to have someone like Alan McArthur do that work for us is remarkable. So thank you very much for putting that together, Andrew. It's a real legacy piece that will last as a reflect on the legacy of McArthur forever. So it'll be in the ether forever, this recording. I'd like to thank Ben Smith for facilitating it and putting the chat box where you can join the practitioners network for Predictive Services Bushfire. I think it's practitioners network if you want to. And also Deb Sparks for supporting it. Now, there are a couple of questions that have come in the chat box. I think, Andrew, do you see them there?
I can see one from Tony S. Do you have records of where the burns were on Black Mountain? I don't think we have specific locations. We have general areas. We had an honours student who went for a walk on Black Mountain and came back with a piece of metal that Phil Cheney identified as being one of the tags that had been dropped during one of Alan McArthur's burns, but I don't think we have any specific locations for each burn. So, no.
Thanks, Andrew. And there's a bit of frivolity there from Mark Claddell from Tassie about the use of the word explosive and other terms. So we won't justify that with the response, but we'll note it's a bit of Mark's humour. So thanks, Mark, for that. All right, look, with that, I might close it. As I said, you can join the network if you haven't already to get information on upcoming webinars. There are also 14 existing webinars on the AFAC News YouTube. So if you just Google AFAC News YouTube, and in the playlists there's a Predictive Services playlist, and there's 14 there. So if you're looking for some more interesting information, they go back for about 2 or 3 years, those webinars. We're getting a little bit more professional as we get used to this technology, but so there's 14 ones there that you can work your way through. So I might leave it there. Thank you very much, Andrew, and good day to everyone. So thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you, everybody.